Hello, students. This is Professor Gordon. This is part two of the recorded lecture on the exploration and colonization. For what we're going to talk about is the European impact on tremendous impact on the Western Hemisphere, and also the Western Hemisphere's impact on the Eastern Hemisphere, particularly with the Columbian Exchange. When we get to that part later in another part of the recorded lecture. And so in part one, I kind of gave a brief introduction about where it's commonly theorized that Native Americans originated from, and that is Asia. And so we introduced some of the early civilizations of the Mayans and the Aztecs. I want to kind of come back to the Mayans and Aztecs and cover them a little more in depth, then talk about the other people groups that are north of them, because this is U.S. history instead of just world history. And so the Olmec people, which were the precursor to the Mayans, began around 700 BCE, and they were known for their famous Olmec heads and so forth that they would make. And they also, Olmec people were particularly prominent for their burial grounds and so forth. But they originated, lived along the Gulf of Mexico, and then the civilization that kind of replaced them were the Mayans. And the Mayans were mostly farmers, had these big, large-scale cities. In fact, Tikal had about 20,000 residents. In fact, I've had some of my world history classes do a film assignment on a documentary about the Mayans and Tikal particularly. But most were farmers whose labor built the city's huge stone temples, which are massive. You can still tour them. My wife and I, when we honeymooned in the Yucatan Peninsula, we were actually, we got married the year the swine flu outbreak happened. And we were going to go see Tulum, which is this famous, beautiful Mayan ruins right there on the coast. Crystal clear blue water. My parents have seen it and raved about it. But because of the swine flu, we ended up not being able to get transportation, and ended up the excursion was canceled. We had a chance to go to Chichen Itza, but it was going to be an all-day affair, and I don't want to drag my wife on her honeymoon to a historical site. Now I think we would really enjoy doing it when we figure out a chance to go back there. So really an elite class claiming descent from the gods ruled the Mayan society, and they lived in splendor on goods and taxes extracted from peasant families. Mayan astronomers created this calendar, which really probably one of the things in history that makes the Mayans most well known. And they also developed zero, or at least they used zero in their math, which some civilizations never used the term zero. They also kind of predicted the eclipses of the sun and the moon from this calendar. They also developed a hieroglyphic writing to record royal lineages and wars, etc. And beginning around 800, the Mayan civilization went in decline. Evidence suggests a 2-century-long drought pushed overtaxed peasants to the countryside. So they left the city-states, which really was the backbone of the Mayan civilization, and said, see ya. By about 900, many religious centers had been abandoned, but a second major Mesoamerican civilization developed in the highlands of Mexico around the city of Teotihuacan. Now, Teotihuacan, if we were in world history, we would talk more about the civilization of Teotihuacan because it's famous. They had a magnificent pyramid of the sun. You can actually go see it because it's not Tenochtitlan, which gets destroyed by the Spanish when the Aztec civilization falls later by Hernan Cortez. Teotihuacan is actually outside of Mexico City. It's not too far from there, and you can actually go see the remnants of this pyramid of the sun. So around CE 500 was kind of its height. The biggest city, about 100,000 inhabitants. Later, Tenochtitlan, with 200,000 inhabitants, is going to surpass it. But about 800 CE, the city was in decline, eventually taken over by the very warlike and aggressive people known as the Aztecs, and so forth. Now, speaking of the Aztecs, also commonly called the Mexica, they entered the great central valley of Mexico from the north and settled on the island of Lake Texcoco. Now, sometimes people, as historians, have theorized that the Aztecs migrated and were kind of a people group from the Toltecs, which are famous for their big burial mounds and so forth. In fact, you can actually go see a Toltec burial mound in eastern Arkansas. I went there on a field trip when I was in elementary school. And so the Aztecs mastered a complex irrigation system and also had developed a written language and established an elaborate culture with a hierarchical social order, very much hierarchical. They were very aggressive, and they subjugated most of the people of central Mexico by forcing them to pay tribute and also forcing them to give up captives to be sacrificed. They were very violent. And we'll see when the Spanish come in, they're going to play on their unpopularity to have other civilizations help rise up and overthrow the Aztecs, and that's how the Spanish defeated them. Um, and so, well, I've talked about in the first part kind of about why they sacrificed and so forth. But Aztec merchants forged trading routes that crisscrossed the empire and imported furs, gold, textiles, food, also obsidian, which was thing that was used for kind of value and wealth and so forth. But they trade as far north as the Rio Grande, which separates Texas from Mexico today, and as far south as present-day Panama. And from there, Panamanians would trade with civilizations in Colombia, Ecuador, and Peru. And so that's kind of interesting. By 1500, the Tenochtitlan had grown into a metropolis with magnificent palaces and temples and more than 200,000 inhabitants, making it by far the largest city when the Europeans arrived in the Western Hemisphere. The Aztecs artisans worked in stone, pottery, cloth, leather, and especially obsidian, a hard volcanic glass used to make sharp-edged weapons and tools. And so obsidian is that's one of the things we can study from as archaeologists and so forth. And when the Spanish come, they're really amazed at Tenochtitlan and the Aztecs. They rave about its sophistication and so forth, even though they thought they were very brutal people. Let's talk about the Indians of the North. The societies north of the Rio Grande, so present-day Texas and north, were less complex. Okay, for one thing, is they didn't have the food supply to have such large populations, and therefore large populations tend to develop more complex civilizations. They were also less coercive than those to the south. They lack occupational diversity, social hierarchy, and strong state institutions. So they weren't this powerful empire and militaries and so forth. Most northern peoples lived in self-governing tribes made up of clans, groups of related families that trace their lineage to a real or legendary common ancestor. Clan elders and local chiefs set war policy, conducted ceremonies, and resolved personal feuds. To prevent inbreeding, they made sure people could not marry within the same clan, which is kind of interesting because they saw the harmful effects of inbreeding. To prevent inbreeding, elders and chiefs usually did not form a distinct ruling class. Instead, they ruled with limited powers through a kinship system of government that was local and worked by consent. Okay, and also the culture of these lineage-based societies did not encourage the accumulation of material goods. Individual ownership of land was virtually unknown. Okay, now the Hopewell culture, you want to star them. They appear frequently on quizzes and tests. And oftentimes they would appear on the AP US History exam as well. So around 100 CE, the vigorous Hopewell people of present-day Ohio had increased their food supply by domesticating plants, organized themselves in large villages, and set up a trading network that stretched from present-day Louisiana to Wisconsin. So did the people of the Western Hemisphere trade? Yes. Was it as large-scale as those in the Eastern Hemisphere, like the Silk Road, the Trans-Saharan, the Indian Ocean trade, or the Mediterranean Sea trade? No. Part of the reason why is it wasn't over by water like the Indian Ocean, Mediterranean Sea trade. Secondly, they have large pack animals like the Trans-Saharan with the camel and the Silk Road with the horse and other animals and so forth. They also use the camel on the Silk Road. So that's why. They imported obsidian from the Yellowstone region of the Rocky Mountains, which was used to make arrowheads and so forth, and tools. Copper from the Great Lakes. Copper was kind of a precious metal to them. It's still a precious metal today. Pottery and marine shells from the Gulf of Mexico. The Hopewell built large burial mounds and surrounded them with extensive circular, rectangular, or octagonal earthworks that were in some cases that still survive today. I'll show you a picture in just a minute. And for an unknown reason, their trade network declined by 400. I don't know if it was from tuberculosis, warfare, decline of economic conditions. Who knows? Okay, that's what obsidian looks like. It's pretty cool. You can see the Hopewell culture. So they connected Wisconsin all the way down to Louisiana. That's a pretty impressive trade network. Okay, this is what a Hopewell culture burial mound would look like, and this is kind of how they buried individuals. Excuse me. So let's talk about the Southwestern people and also how the environment shapes their way of life more so than other regions. So a second complex culture developed among the Pueblo people of the Southwest were the Hohokams, Mogolans, and the Anasazi. Anasazi appear on quizzes and tests frequently as well. By 600 CE, the Hohokam people in the high country along the border of present-day Arizona and New Mexico were using irrigation to grow two crops a year. So they could have two crop cycles, fashioning fine pottery and red-on buff designs and worshiping their gods on Mesoamerican-like platform mounds. By 1000 CE, they were living in elaborate multi-room stone structures called pueblos. I'm going to show you a picture of that in just a minute. This is where we get the Pueblo people. Okay, they're very much remembered because of their way they lived. In the Mimbres Valley of present-day New Mexico, the Mogollon people lived. And about 900 CE to the north, the Anasazi, or the ancestral Pueblo, people had become master architects. They built residential ceremonial villages and steep cliffs. A Pueblo in Chaco Canyon that housed 1,000 people. My parents have actually seen it. If you ever wear Chaco sandals, that's where it was named from. They also developed 400 miles of straight roads in the mountains, which is impressive. But the culture of the Pueblo peoples gradually collapsed after about 1150 CE. And the reason why historians and archaeologists think that it was the case is because of soil exhaustion and extended droughts and disrupted maize production that prompted the abandonment of Chaco Canyon and other communities. So when you can't feed your families, then your civilization is going to change. Okay. The Acomas, the Zunis, and the Hopis later built strong but smaller village societies better suited to the dry and unpredictable climate of the American Southwest. Still today, water is such a precious resource in the American Southwest. Here's a Pueblo village. Now you can see modern day doors and windows and stuff on it, but you get the idea. It's adobe buildings. Pretty cool. Okay. Talked about the Anasazi people of Southwestern. This is Chaco Canyon. So cool. I'm honestly surprised I haven't been there. My parents have been there. Hoping to take my wife and kids soon, but pretty cool. Okay, now the Mississippian culture. This is about 800 CE. Let's talking about the Mississippi River Valley, the most important river in present-day United States. It's the farming technology of Mesoamerica had reached the Mississippi River Valley, probably potentially carried by Mayan refugees from war-torn Yucatan Peninsula. Who knows? That's a theory, but not fully known. And by planting new strains of maize and beans, the Mississippian peoples produced an agricultural surplus that allowed them to live in small, fortified temple cities where they developed a robust culture. Now, the Mississippi River Valley is one of the most fertile places in all the world. The soil there is black because it's so rich with nutrients. It's a great farming part of our country today. I grew up not too far from the Mississippi Delta. I actually grew up about 10-minute drive to the Arkansas River farmlands, but very important farming part of our country. By 1150, the largest city, Cahokia, near present-day St. Louis, boasted a population of about 15 to 20,000 and more than 100 temple mounds. So if you've ever been to St. Louis and if you ever go to the Arch, not too far from where the St. Louis Cardinals play, if you're a St. Louis Cardinals fan, if you turn around and turn turn east instead of west, a lot of people use because it's considered the gateway, the Arch to the west. Turn around and look directly east, a little bit of distance, kind of past East St. Louis. There is where Cahokia was, and I'll show you what it looks like today here in just a minute. And so one of them was as large as the Great Egyptian Pyramids. That's how large of a pyramid mound that the Cahokia built. Peasants paid tribute to nobles and priests who were part of the privileged class. They did practice human sacrifice. About 1350, the Mississippian civilization went into rapid decline. The largest population overburdened the environment, depleting nearby forests and herds of deer. Also, the Indians fell a victim to tuberculosis and other deadly urban diseases. So tuberculosis, what they think was part of the big reason, because of bacterial infection of the lungs. Spanish explorer Hernando de Soto invaded the region in the 1540s and found the Apalachee and Timucua Indians living in permanent settlements under the command of powerful chiefs. So let me show you. That's what Cahokia looks like today. Now, here's what they think it looked like back in its heyday. Boom. Okay, that was a pretty big, large pyramid mound for religious purposes. Okay, you can see their thatched roofs. Okay, now the Eastern Woodlands people, who a lot of the English settlers are going to first encounter. The cultures of native peoples of North America were diverse. Many tribes that De Soto's expedition met were unintentionally given European diseases that they had never encountered before. These diseases killed a majority of their population, such as the Natchez, which is down in southern Mississippi, the Creeks, which is Alabama, Georgia, and some of them settled in Florida. The Choctaws, which are Mississippi, and the Chickasaws were also in Mississippi and part of Alabama. And these Muskogean-speaking societies and among the Algonquian tribes who lived further north to the east, and in present-day Virginia, farming became the work of women. While the men hunted and fished, women used flint hoes to raise corn, squash, and beans. So these were the crops that primarily led to a sedentary lifestyle, but they still hunted. Like I said, North America, particularly the eastern part of North America, is blessed with a lot of natural wildlife. And because of the importance of farming, matrilineal society developed among many Eastern peoples. They were some of the only civilizations in world history where your lineage was passed down through the mother. The Jewish civilization was like this. Okay. Also, you had the 5 nations of the Iroquois who lived in present-day New York State. We'll talk a lot about them in Module 1 in U.S. history because they're the most powerful Indian confederation in U.S. history. Very much a force to be reckoned with. Women cultivated the fields around semi-permanent settlements and passed the use rights of the fields to their daughters. And in these matrilineal societies, so remember, matrilineal means it's passed down from your lineages through your mother. The father stood outside of the main lines of descent and authority, and the principal responsibility for child raising fell on the mother and her mother. So it's still kind of like a patriarchal society in terms of men held the power and did some of the most important jobs in terms of fighting. But women played a very important role with farming and raising the children. And your descendants went through your mother's side of the family instead of the father's. That's what makes it matrilineal. Okay. Families live with their sisters rather than sometimes with their wives. Among these farming peoples, religious rituals centered on the agricultural cycle. Although the Eastern Indian peoples of 1500 CE ate a balanced diet of meat and vegetables, they enjoyed a few material comforts with their populations growing slowly. When the Europeans came into the picture, most Eastern woodland Indians lived in relatively small kinship-based societies, and there were no great Indian empires or religious centers north of the Rio Grande when the Europeans came. So were there large-scale civilizations like you see with the Mayans and the Aztecs and the Incas north of the Rio Grande when the Europeans arrived? No. Cahokia would have been, but it went in decline a few hundred years before the Europeans arrived. So I want to make that distinction. Remember that for the test, for Module 1 test, is there was no large-scale civilizations north of the Rio Grande when the Europeans arrived, but the Cahokia was there before the Europeans arrived, but it just went in decline because of drought, environmental problems, overworking the lands, overhunting the food population, and most likely tuberculosis or some other urban disease. Okay. Now, when we get to part 3, we're going to talk about why did Europeans explore? That's one of the most important questions in world history is why did they end up going across the world to find new lands and looking for new trade routes? And we'll get to that. It's a very important lecture. You want to make sure that you watch part 3. I would argue it's one of, especially for world history, it's a huge part of what we talk about. So we'll come back to that in the next part.